All right, we are back, moving along on our agenda, following up on our discussion on the community schools program grant that we created a few years ago. We are happy to welcome back some folks from the AOE to bring us up to speed and maybe perhaps talk a little bit about what the future may or may not hold. This was a limited time offer. Anyway, I'm going to turn it over to the three of you. If you just introduce yourselves as we go along, that'd be great. And thank you very much for coming down and joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So for the record, I'm Jessica Carolus. I'm Division Director of the Student Pathways Division at the Agency of Education. And my division was charged with managing and implementing the Act 67 statute and developing the grant program. I'm joined by two colleagues, and I just want to point out one of my colleagues, Pat, is joined because we're also transitioning into the curriculum discussion following the presentation. So I'm joined by Bernice Garnett. Sure, for the record.
Yeah, for the record, I'm Bernice Garnett. I'm an associate professor in the College of Education and Social Services at the University of Vermont, and I've been co-leading the research practice partnership on community schools with Jess, which we'll talk about.
Great. So I just wanted to start the first slide after the introductory slide, the what and why of community schools. And I think this is included both in the Act 67, but also just to remind folks that there is a plethora of research and national literature on this. But generally, the driving considerations are that community schools are not programs, rather they're a fundamental rethinking of how we deliver public education. As a model, community schools align to Vermont's student-centered learning regulatory framework, particularly in support of personalization, flexible pathways, proficiency-based learning, and fundamentally, community schools seek to close equity gaps. And so when we were designing the grant program, and as we've continued our work, including through the Research Practice Partnership, we know that Vermont Community Schools is really a value statement, and particularly in service to our orienting statute, 16 VSA Section 1, around making sure that every student has access to an equitable public education. So it was really important in both developing the grant program, but also the work going forward, that the Agency of Education actually leaned into and modeled the values of community schools. And that meant that when we were engaging in this work, we had to recognize that we were a participant within the implementation of the statute, and we would impact how that progressed, both through design and also through participation. So in some of the considerations, and particularly as we have been developing our evaluation processes, we wanted to design for equity and sustainability. So that meant we had to prioritize fostering community, we had to establish a supportive accountability approach, and we really needed to develop an ethical framework for evaluation. So a few examples of fostering community, which the slide called Pillar Talk, which we think is cute, but maybe isn't so funny. But we wanted to make sure that we established quarterly cohort meetings of all of the awardees. And we have been doing that since year one, where leadership teams from those awarded projects could identify shared successes, opportunities and challenges, engage in collaborative problem solving, inform state level work. We needed to have that feedback loop. It needed to go in both directions. And we wanted to develop, as a community, a shared understanding of community schools in the Vermont context. We also, this year, launched a bi-monthly community school coordinator learning series to help support the CSCs, who often are the primary responsible party for facilitating all of the different components of the projects, and to provide two things. One is structured learning opportunities, but then unstructured space for specific problem solving. And then finally, and this is again from year one, and it was a holdover from the grant review committee, is we have been maintaining an interdisciplinary team every 6 weeks. Sometimes it does get rescheduled or canceled, to advise, problem solve, and identify connections and opportunities for coherent state level innovations. Our supportive accountability approach is making sure that while we want to evaluate community schools as a whole, we know that each community school looks different. So we wanted to develop personalized reflection tools, which we did in year one, organized by pillar, documenting progress towards strategies, activities, and the 3-year goals that they did in their initial 3-year grant application. And we wanted to make sure that not only were we marking that progress, but we were capturing successes of new learning. We also established quarterly check-in meetings with each project. And at the end of year one, and we will continue to do this, we conducted end-of-year empathy interviews. So finally, to get to the ethical framework for evaluation, I think this is where we really want to lean into and provide a little bit of space to talk about establishing the research practice partnership. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Of course. So it was really important that the way we approached the evaluation embodied the values of community schools, making sure it was equity oriented, locally defined, strategic, and also participatory. And what I mean by participatory is research practice partnerships really harness all stakeholders as authentic research partners. So it really tries to dismantle the ivory tower of research where knowledge production and dissemination is owned by academics, right? And that there's a one-way relationship between I get to study you all, remove the data, and you're not part of that process. And so research practice partnerships, I approach Jess. Thankfully, she responded to a cold email I sent last year because I was really jazzed about Act 67. And I really see the power of community schools to advance the educational goals of Vermont as a whole. I work extensively in Vermont schools related to restorative practices and tied into the national community schools space. And so a lot of energy in the national movement about what's happening in Vermont. And so we wanted to replicate, but also, as you all know, Vermont is unique and specific and contextually dependent. And most of the research on community schools nationally is from very large urban areas, right? And so we needed to understand rural community school implementation in Vermont in the context of a pandemic in a 3-year limited funding cycle. And because the AOE is such a deep partner in the work, our research practice partnership involves the SEA, so Jess and Johannes, and then the community school awardees themselves, where we are meeting bi-weekly with the AOE folks, and then through those quarterly cohort meetings, getting feedback on what do you all want to define as success, right? In 3 years, we can't expect gross long-term outcomes to change. That would be setting up a program for failure without time to build into the implementation. And so some of those attributes of our research practice partnership really embody some Vermont ideals and goals, but also the work of the community schools. So really making sure our relationships were centered on deep partnerships and earned trust, as opposed to proxy trust. Proxy trust is when someone with a title and an organizational identity can walk into a space and have proxy trust, right? Because I've got all these fancy degrees, I work at an institution, but I don't have any deep connections. And so Jess and I, for a whole year, we're making connections with each other before I even really interacted with the community school awardees to make sure that they felt safe and supported, so that the evaluation felt like it was supporting their work as opposed to you're not doing enough, a deficit-based mindset. So in addition to that deep time it takes to build relational trust, we also wanted to focus on collecting multiple sources of information. So in a mixed methods, multi-year evaluation design, we're really centering qualitative narrative stories of standing up a community school. What does it look like? What's that process? So in evaluation speak, we're looking at process implementation first and foremost, and then thinking about outcomes later, and really to resist the urge of has graduation rates changed before we understand what's even happening on the ground. So we're doing a lot of logic model building and doing qualitative interviews, and we're going to talk about that later. So that's really the framework of our research practice partnership, trying to level the hierarchy of power that's involved in research and evaluation to make sure that both the SEA and our Act 67 community school awardees feel ownership and supported in the evaluation work.
I think what I appreciate about Bernice, I instituted a policy for myself the first year, which was I would accept every phone call or email about community schools, which I have revisited. but I appreciate that it was interactional, it wasn't transactional. We weren't jumping into, you should do this. I think at the time of implementation, our awardees, who I think you've heard from some of them, are doing really incredible work, but also we're managing pandemic conditions. And so wanting to preserve their space to get comfortable, and for Bernice to respect that and affirm that was really powerful, and I think has afforded us a level of success.
So we have a couple of guiding research questions just to orient you all to how we're thinking about understanding the success of Act 67, not necessarily the success of community schools writ large. This is success of Act 67. So this is a 3-year timeline with allocated funds in the midst of a pandemic. So our research questions are really contextually dependent to those circumstances, right? So what are the experiences of new community schools sorry.
In implementing key organizational structures of the community school model.
Right.
How has the funding support from the Vermont Community School Act enabled awardees to create and implement community school vision?
Yep.
How are community schools integrating existing school-based systems of support and academic enrichment with new priority areas? And that was also built into the application to make those connections for folks, not in an exhaustive list, but to say, you have been engaging in some of this work. And what are the preliminary outcomes of CS implementation in Vermont community schools supported through Act 67? And again, that idea of it's easy to jump to, so have literacy outcomes improved, right? Has attendance improved? And we will be looking at those data, but I think because this is a new way of doing school, right? It's literally to say, we're going to measure everything, right? We have inbuilt data collection mechanisms, but what we're trying to identify are what are new areas that we need to research and capture information and evidence as opposed to just sort of replicating existing processes.
And so in our research practice partnership, all stakeholders, right, bring unique expertise and knowledge. It's all valued and appreciated. And so one of the things that I think that I can sometimes do is bring that national literature to the research practice partnership. So we're constantly playing with, oh, here's a new article from the Philadelphia Community Schools world. How do we want to think about the ways in which Vermont might want to pull down from some of the national emerging and budding interest on trying to make community schools more replicable and successful nationwide. So a bunch of pretty high powerful think tanks and 60 different universities got together over the summer and created a couple different new guiding frameworks called Community Schools Forward. And so the image that on slide, whatever number slide this is called, Informed by the Community Schools Literature 10, I really wanted to put this on here to showcase the ways in which we are approaching our evaluation within the developmental stages of community schools, right? So we wouldn't expect within 3 years for graduation rates necessarily to change. And this figure is showing the different stages of community schools emerging, developing the vision, hiring the coordinators, doing the needs assessment, figuring out which pillars might be already synergistically supported by other educational policies. Where does new work need to be needed? Into the maturing, starting to think about the use of data to inform policies, and then the transforming. And that's where we're trying to get to, that sustainable implementation of community schools. And you can see at the bottom of this chart is the benchmarks and the data pieces that you should be thinking about within those stages of community school implementation, right? So within the beginning, you want to be looking at increased participation rates and service use. So if you're having a community dialogue night, or if Urgens is doing a ton of work related to food insecurity and community meal kit distribution, how many community meal kits are being distributed, right? Looking at dosage, participation to see if folks are starting to participate before you look at outcomes, because we wouldn't expect outcomes to change if participation hasn't changed, right? So this is just to give you a sense of the ways in which we're integrating, but also modifying the national landscape on community school effectiveness to make it Vermont specific, and to think about the role of virality in being an opportunity, but also a barrier, and thinking through the ways in which community partnerships look, transportation, expanded learning opportunities, mentorship, food insecurity and access, community resources, all of that's unique to the rurality of Vermont. And so we're integrating the emerging cutting edge research from the national landscape, but really making it Vermont with the goal of Act 67 being a pilot. So if community schools and other schools in Vermont want to adapt, implement, modify community schools, we can use the data tools we're developing, and we can use the information that we're gleaning that's working to support that ecosystem of community schools in Vermont that really needs to be responsive to the conditions of place.
And I think that what's powerful about this, and a model in thinking about how do we evaluate other programs and initiatives in Vermont, is that we are mediating national literature and learning with those three sort of areas: Vermont context, right? Statewide implementation, which is, I think we're the ones doing it.
Yes.
And a statewide, an SEA, HEI, research practice partnership, UVM, Agency of Education. Many times we actually get evaluated with protocols, rubrics, measures that aren't consistent with our regulatory infrastructure. So it was really important to make sure that we were considering those three factors.
So to give you a sense of some of the data sources we're beginning to look at and we'll be collecting annually. So as we mentioned before, we really wanted to lean into the what does it feel like, look like? What are the experiences of community school coordinators, principals, and superintendents that are standing up these models? So we're doing empathy interviews every year. Jess and the AOE has built in substantial tracking through the grant mechanics. So there is a lot of information that we already have to dig through. One of our goals of our research practice partnership was to minimize survey fatigue and burden on schools. Schools are surveyed out. There is incredible fatigue of data collection that, in my mind, schools don't often find the utility of participating in some of the research because they don't see the benefit immediately to them. So we're really trying to be pragmatic and reduce primary data collection burden right now and think about the ways in which we can utilize existing data sources to help us understand what's happening. Mm-hmm. Of course, we're going to need to do some data collection, but there is such a wealth of data already out there. So for example, the Vermont Education Dashboard, the statewide longitudinal data system, has tons of educational outcomes that we can think about. And then my background's actually in public health. And so I have strong connections with our Vermont Department of Health, and there's rich data sets within thinking about, because community schools, right, is a holistic approach to both student positive youth development, but also family and community health and wellness and economic development that we need to be measuring across the continuum of those domains. And so the youth risk behavior surveillance survey, and then the adult version, which is the behavior risk factor surveillance survey, and then the school health profiles are just small examples of existing data sets that already have data administration, and we can drill down at the local level, at the school level, some of those outcomes. So we're really excited to think pragmatically about the use of data to reduce that burden on schools.
So getting to year one insights on slide 12, and again, it was really important that we center qualitative and anecdotal data as well as those predictable data collections that can give us some of those predictable student outcomes. I actually conduct the empathy interviews, and we populate those documents and those check-in tools. But we have the enormous benefit of both Bernice, but also Peter Knox, who is not here, to sort of ingest and start to organize that. So we engage in transcript coding to identify themes, right? So based on those empathy interviews, based on what we are collecting, those insights over time, how can we start to identify trends that then can inform policy and practice? So we used defined community school pillars, Act 67, the statute, and the community context. We took a collaborative approach of the relational and research perspectives embodied here, and then developed a code set and really, I think 14 codes. Mm-hmm. But we gave you a few examples such as integrated student supports, family engagement, cohort leadership characteristics, et cetera. And then through that evaluation planning, we want to identify metrics and start to develop both local logic models that then will roll up to a state logic model.
So the next slide is a visual, and we can pass out color handouts so you can see some of the color images. So we're using a qualitative data analysis software called NVivo, which has helped synthesize and find trends with a lot of text. And so we will be collecting and administering these interviews yearly. So it'll be interesting to see the trends over time. But after year one, so this is the end of last year, the codes that are in bigger boxes indicate more saturation, or that they were had more frequency that we found them. And so you can see here from year one, cohort leadership characteristics, which we'll talk actually a fair, maybe not a fair amount because we have a lot of time, but we'll talk a little bit about.
It's the focus of our discussion.
It's the focus of our discussion. So that's the
you have an hour, and
we can, okay.
We can adjust.
Right.
You don't need to cut it off.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I want to point out, this is an unusual way to present information, but we did that intentionally. Because what we don't want to do is suggest that there's a hierarchy or a level of importance across the characteristics. Again, what we know, and you've probably heard from some of the awardees, is that their emphasis on pillar work, their foregrounding and backgrounding of different work to respond to community need is going to mean that there's going to be adjustments. But we're looking at, can we establish that there are common themes and characteristics that are important when we are thinking about future design considerations?
Mm-hmm. So we're going to give you sort of a flavor of what these codes feel like with showcasing some illustrious quotes from our community school awardees. And the codes that we wanted to highlight today are the cohort leadership characteristics. And this is really something that emerged from the data that actually corresponds quite beautifully with national literature. There are unique attitudes and dispositions of the community school coordinators and the principals that really help catalyze and support this work. That is important to actually surface if we do want to advance this model across the state. There's opportunities for pre-service and in-service professional development for principals and community school coordinators that align with this way of thinking. Because community schools is a way of doing schools, there's a value set that undergirds that. And that value set has to be cultivated so the work doesn't feel disingenuous. Similar to the restorative practice work. There's a value set that undergirds restorative practices, and that implementation of RP is not going to feel authentic if that value set isn't cultivated. And so that's what the cohort leadership characteristics.
I think another important observation, and particularly in year one, is there was so much disruption. As you are probably aware, I might have mentioned this last year, folks weren't immediately available to hire folks. Plans that they made were interrupted. And so the leaders of these projects really leaned in, right, and extended themselves and engaged in this really dynamic thinking. They were adaptive. And so it's really important that we capture this.
Yeah. And then there's other, the community school characteristics speaks to the community partnerships and connections between the school and the community, right? So that the community schools really think about this hub of resources. So that code taps into that. And then the third one thinks about collaborative leadership, which of course is a pillar of Act 67, but how are schools thinking about shared decision-making, use of data to inform practice? So
we have a quote from one of the awardees on slide 15. And I've highlighted some important, the entire quote is amazing, but really in thinking about they're prioritizing, localizing and building networks of connection that are really rooted in the kind of community and democratic ideals that we know our, landmark legislation supports. And interestingly, that there are 5 pillars, but there's also sort of an ethos or philosophy or a kind of deeper commitment to the ways in which people are in relationship to each other. And so I think this really does capture also that our leaders have vision. The community school characteristics on slide 16, another quote. Again, I encourage you to read the whole thing, but I wanted to highlight that they mentioned we took more on as schools with the social community, with mental health and even physical health and food, and even more so in the pandemic. I think what this grant does for me is really lock in that circle of community, that community circle beyond just the parent partner. And so, and identifying how they were leveraging these funds in this grant program to really lean into that community building. And then finally, collaborative leadership. We have systems in place that will help. So we use the global best practices as our self-study tool in the leadership team. And then as they distribute it, it was a way of building consensus and building a shared vision and then being able to move forward. And so again, that idea that they were establishing and leveraging existing systems to expand their collaborative leadership models. So emerging themes and observations. And this is a quote from another awardee, we're a community school. Everything that happens here is a school function. And I just love that. I want to make bumper stickers. Okay, so leadership, community school mindset, and I will pass this out.
Another colorful, fancy handout to complement this slide. So as I was speaking to before, this community school mindset that really bubbled up organically from this year one empathy interviews. When we were coding the interviews, I didn't have this national framework in mind, but I knew this research existed. And so I'm sharing this because when we shared with the community school coordinators and principals that the way that they approach this work, their attitudes, their disposition, their ability to be asset oriented, to be adaptive, to be responsive to community needs, to be focusing on equity, aligns with actually the national best practices on community school principal and coordinator leadership. And they had this moment of feeling seen and heard for the work. It was this, and they were like, you sure you didn't know this, Bernice, before you coded the interviews? And I said, no, it bubbled up. And then I toggled back and forth with the national literature. So Kathleen Provenzano and Linda Mager from Drexel University in Philadelphia researched community schools in Philly, and they came up with these 5 characteristics of community school principal leadership qualities that our community school coordinators and principal are exemplifying at really amazing ways given the context of implementation. And so we wanted to crosswalk some of the work nationally with the work that's happening in Vermont. And so we've got some quotes connected to that.
And to spotlight this mindset, and I'm happy that Pat's here, one of the awarded SU's, White River Valley Supervisory Union, the superintendent is also engaged and reached out to us. And I believe I mentioned this in the Act 28 update. We've been piloting for 2 years sort of a participatory action research approach to helping folks refine their proficiencies and engage in some of that mapping work. And Pat is leading that effort, and White River Valley reached out. And so this was this natural connection that we're also making internal to the agency to say, okay, how do we start to capture all of the work that's happening that's very complex, but all in service to one goal, which is improving outcomes for students and ensuring education equity. Leaders are, yeah, go ahead.
Go, you read it.
Okay, communicating vision. I think that this is essential too, right? One of the challenges I think when we think about our regulatory infrastructure and thinking about all of the policies and all of the rules and all of the legislation around education is sometimes it's hard to think about what is the story. Mm-hmm. And so I think what our leaders are really demonstrating is that they can communicate the vision of school, right? So community schools at their best start to decenter school and recenter the kind of networks of relationships around young people that helps them feel like learners. Community school is the center of a community that the community has pride in. And as the outcomes for the students improve, then the community is also bolstered. And if the community is flourishing and thriving, then the students will. So community school doesn't believe in artificial separation of their students. I believe a community school is a fully integrated and important piece of the community that reflects the community's hopes, dreams, and pride. And likewise, the school has to be proud of its community and integrated with it. So that's how I see it. And I love that. So that's how I see it.
In addition to having this visionary out of the box thinking that really exemplifies that whole child's integrated schools as a hub of community, we aligned some quotes with that work that I mentioned from Drexel University about personal characteristics of the community school leaderships, the attitudes and dispositions, and then their behaviors. I don't know if we want to spend time reading all the quotes, but maybe just this one, just that one on the outside embodies that mindset and visionary leadership, which is of course the structural supports to do this work. And that's what we really wanted to highlight after year one. The structural supports are incredibly important to sustain because community schools don't just happen, right? It's an intense amount of work to sustain this, this framework.
So on the slide, a lot of inequity has been highlighted by the pandemic. How can these resources be brought to re-educate ourselves about what our community needs in order to thrive, what our students need in order to thrive, and how can we reallocate to meet those needs? That's a million things, a lot of different directions, but it is all connected for me now. And I think that idea, that foregrounding background, that responding to change, that rethinking and not sort of just forging ahead, that is a disservice to school communities. I think it also reifies the context that we're currently in, right? Which pandemic disruption continues and remains and will be here for some time. So I'm going to skip over slide 22. We're including some additional quotes just so that you can get a flavor and hear people's voices specifically. But we wanted to also identify that there is a significant commitment to developing coherence and strategic narratives, and that people have leveraged the opportunity that Act 67 provided to advance existing work and integrate new work. And so cohort leaders are always using community schools as a unifying narrative to articulate and advance existing strategic plans and source for creative problem solving. And I think a great example would be one awardee. I keep the 5 pillars on my wall next to me because, you know, in every conversation, there's a way that a combination of the pillars can be brought to resolve a concern that comes up. Right. And I think that's really powerful. I think another awardee has talked about in looking at that funding, it provided an opportunity to not have strategic plans get fundamentally disrupted and to continue that work to improving outcomes for students.
And another aspect of engaged leadership is that collaboration, which really, that pillar related to collaborative leadership, we want to understand how folks are thinking about engaging with that. And so that intentional dialogue, being present in the community, listening to community needs, and also being able to pivot quite quickly was exemplified in many of our community school sites. And so we wanted to, again, be able to understand the situations and conditions necessary to create collaborative and engaged leadership.
Okay, so slide 25, sort of transitioning to preparing for the future, now what? And I would another title of that slide could be Things That Keep Me Up at Night. So this is a quote from one of our awardees. So we're seeing parents and family members coming back to school communities, wanting to be in the school and wanting to be connected, right? And the next slide, 27, provides a real insight into how fundamental Act 67 and the funding was to ensuring that they could provide those opportunities and have the flexibility to support what was necessary in order to create those conditions in which the community can come in. And I don't know, I think Jason spoke with you, and I don't know if he shared, but there are structural problems that really need to be addressed. But the more that you have those flexible spending opportunities to address some of the barriers for community members in engaging and realizing the goals of community schools, the better. So, you know, just if you look at the bottom, I've never seen any funding source that kind of seems to understand the connection between these things like the community schools grant has allowed for. So the next slide is actually something I presented to US Ed. And I think folks are aware there's a lot of interest in what we're doing. And we were provided an opportunity to provide feedback to say, what would be our perspective in how we could scale community schools. And one of the things that we really have to recognize is that we are a very small state of varying capacities and with very different governance structures, right, across the state when you look at the LEAs. And so I'm sharing with you, not because you can do this, but in thinking about how we might approach this at the state level, but also advocacy when provided additional opportunities to inform congressional delegations or talk to US Ed, is we have an existing program, the 21st Century Community Learning Centers grant program. It's a federal program under ESSA, and they grant to the state, and the state then competes the grant program and distributes funds. And the benefit of that is it provides efficiency and predictability on an annual basis that's coming in. Sometimes there's fluctuations. I'll say in the last several years, it just seems to go up. That supports after-school program, comprehensive after-school program. And what it does is it puts the burden of managing funding on the agency, the state education agency, and not on the locals. It also helps us to establish coherence and reduce initiative fatigue. It provides us the opportunity, right, to say, okay, this is a statewide approach to how we're going to do this. And by the way, here are connections that you might want to think about as you're thinking about all of the funding sources that come into your system and all of the programs that you run. It allows for scaling that when you look at a federal program and, you know, the full service community school program, when I was in New York City, I was in a nonprofit that worked with community schools. When you ask small LEAs to compete at the national level in federal programs, you see a pattern, right? And that doesn't meet our equity goal, right? I mean, it models from top down. So if we care about educational equity, we have to think about designing for educational equity. And when you have those kinds of disparities that play out from students and families all the way up to systems, you can't get to scale. And then finally, avenues for small rural districts and schools to compete, and thinking about that competition, thinking about how when it is not governed, right, through the state education agency, you start to cultivate what folks have called innovation zones. And innovation zones, and innovation is, yes, right, let's innovate. But innovation zones usually mean that there is a short-term investment, not uniformly, not statewide. You build up capacity in individual areas, the funding runs out, and then what you have is you've exacerbated inequities, right? And so I provided a slide not because you can do anything with it except for you to understand our thinking. Okay, so developing state level strategies for sustainability, right? I think you probably heard from folks, but you know, starting to examine and think deeply about predictable funding to support capacity building grants and scaling community school development. There are existing appropriations that one can look at when we're considering how could we start to inform and advance the community school model. But the rationale, the reason why we want to do this is because we have emerging themes and emerging evidence to suggest that this is also helping us to realize the goals of Act 77 and our education quality standards, and aligns with the updates that have been submitted related to the education quality standards. It also is clearly supporting the goals of Act 1 and Act 173 and Act 28. And so as we're thinking about not seeing those initiatives as separate, distinct programs that are widgets that you can pull out without having an impact, we're seeing those as part of the storytelling related to education in Vermont. I'd also say appropriately resourcing state level supports for sustaining community schools. And I don't want to point to my crutches, but I will say that it's not a common model to have a division director directly managing a grant. And I think when thinking about providing support in a way that can realize meaningful change, you want to make sure that there is thoughts about dedicated staffing to support those schools who are doing not a program, right, whole school change. I think another promising development would be sustainable anchoring organization structures like a research practice partnership, so that we can also inform. So if there isn't funding, how do you sustain the work that has already happened? How do we commit to the folks who have taken the risk now, who have hired people, who have developed structures, who have developed an expectation within their communities so that they can continue the work, right? Because they're going to be the tip of the spear if there's not support financially and there's not programmatic support. And look at, I clicked, we cut like 50 slides. So I'm going to pause. Any questions?
Thanks.
Million.
First of all, when we passed the bill that created the community schools grant program, I didn't realize that, and I assume we didn't have built into it this research arm and all of that. That was something that generated organically within the.
You did build in not more than 1% set aside for technical assistance and not more than 2% for evaluation. Those two combined on an annual basis, you can't hire anybody.
Right.
You can't compete a contract. We will be moving towards contracting for services to build out our evaluation because we're going to need to. We get along, but right, that she's busy. I'm right, that's not sufficient.
Right.
Anyway, I just would say I'm really impressed with the follow-up that's going on to this program and the research into it. I heard a million questions.
Yep.
Yeah, all right. Let's start with the first step here.
Well, I just want to thank you tremendously, because when we had folks in talking about their grants, I just wrote like leadership matters. And it's clear your leadership on this has mattered a lot. This wasn't a transactional grant. This has been clearly a lot of work. And so I can't thank you enough, and how exciting it is, I think, for some of us who got to pass that, to see this development. So let's talk about like the money and the going forward. So what do we need? How much does it become part of the AOE budget? Is it still a grant program? Like, what does this look like in the future to, one, continue the good work that's happening in those initial grants and grow it and not kill you, but also still have your visionary leadership and, care of it that clearly stands out? Like, what do we need to do?
Well, and if I was to look at this slide and start backwards, I think one is thinking about in the work that I oversee within my division, whether it's PBL and personalized learning and content standards, et cetera. You're going to hear some of that. Thinking about, we can support statewide approaches to that work without requiring that everyone does the same thing. And we do that by providing professional learning and support. And so I think strategies like research practice partnerships and building that in, not as something that gets designed but becomes predictable, can be supported. And I think there's different ways that you could do it. Maybe you'd like to share, like, what are some strategies that folks have used?
Sure. So I can speak a little bit to our neighboring New York State, which of course is a very different context, but the state education funds have been used to help create technical assistance centers for community school work. And so Binghamton University, for example, is the Western Region Technical Assistance Center. So I think we should think creatively about how to leverage existing partnerships and expertise and resources in Vermont because it is so small and we do all work. When there is something working well together, how can we fine tune that to sustain that work? And so I think that's one way to think about it. Various doesn't have to necessarily be UVM, but what other partnerships avenues exist to cultivate some of that technical assistance, professional learning, evaluative capacity in partnership with the SEA, because Jess in particular is so pivotal to this work that there has to be a partner, but she's exhausted and can't do this forever and needs staffing around her. And you of course can speak for yourself, but as a new partner in this work, I'm noticing the incredible nature of this SEA relationship with the schools right now. And so and I think you're hearing that too. And so I think to cultivate that, the AOE has to be, the SEA has to be a prominent partner in this, but there are structures in which through the research practice partnership, some of the other work can maybe get not necessarily offloaded, but embraced by other organizations doing this in partnership with the AOE. And so I think, myself and other colleagues at UVM are excited to think about ways that we can support community school evaluation support in the state through service learning, research. We've got lots of students eager to support community schools. So for example, when I was an undergrad in Philadelphia, I taught aerobics after school at the West Philadelphia High School as part of the community school relationship between Penn and the community. So you don't have to hire additional folks. It can be, so I think there's really innovative ways that we can think about on the ground capacity that tap into existing spaces.
Mm-hmm. And I think one thing I would request is also seeing an opportunity and coming, we're going to report again next year. We can do it earlier, but I think looking at what other opportunities does a research practice partnership afford across the educational landscape? We have our data collection system is paid for by federal funds and prioritized to reporting federal metrics, right, and some of our state metrics. If we want to have better insight and think more creatively about how we measure and evaluate educational initiatives and progress, a research practice partnership could be really helpful in getting that more global, rounded out insight. So it could be something that is in service to multiple goals, not just the goals of Act 67. So, maybe doing some thinking around that might be helpful before sort of coming up with some set strategy. I think also, just, and again, reflecting what the community school awardees have talked about is, there is having some funding stream. Now, if we were to break it down on an annual basis, it was about $1 million per year, right? We developed a 3-year project because, again, best practice, right? Education change does not happen in 1 year. It doesn't happen in 3 years. It doesn't happen in 5 years, right? Like it is an ongoing iteration and it requires sustained attention and strategic planning. And so, but this does boost them to start to create the structures, right, that create the conditions for the change that folks are looking for, and to support some of the things that each sort of appropriation is tied to a particular program. And so spending on activities that are outside of that program, particularly when you're thinking about federal funding, right, creates impingements on local leaders, right? So in thinking about a dedicated source of funding that is in service to community schools allows them to do all of that interstitial work that is so fundamental to developing the narrative and telling the story of community schools.
Can I ask a follow-up question? That when you talk about the dedicated source of funding, then are you talking about a dedicated source of funding at the AOE level that then you're dispersing, or dedicated funding?
We could, and again, that's for you to decide. We could do that. We've built a grant program.
Right.
We're trying to, if we don't have to do that, right? Like that's your decision to make. But I would say that having it be managed at a state level, right? And having it be something in which it's a relationship to the state and not to, say, federal or federal partners, right? I don't know how else we can continue to encourage the scale and the work that folks are doing. Someone once said budgets are moral documents, right? So if we want something to happen, we have to think about how do we create the conditions for it to happen.
Representative Austin.
Yep. I'll tell you what keeps me up at night, Jess, is thinking that you're going to leave at some point because you are so, I just have to recognize the work you've done, not only on this project, but on literacy. So impressive. So I just want to.
I appreciate that, but I'm a face here.
Yeah.
It is a part, right, again, right? The work that Pat does
Yeah.
is informing this work, right? The work that my colleagues at the agency are informing this work. I talked about the interdisciplinary team. Someone from licensing is showing up to talk about, oh, do we create, a license for a community school coordinator? Well, that helps the state. They're doing it. So it's not me. And I will just say too, it is absolutely the field, right? We have delegated that authority to schools to provide the equitable education that we're looking for. And I think you heard from folks directly. They have the requisite expertise.
But I think you do create those conditions or encourage it. So I just want to recognize that. I'm wondering about urban versus rural with this model. And do you have to differentiate the models for an urban setting as opposed to a rural setting?
Listen to the expert first, and then I will give you my lived experience.
So the core tenets and the pillars don't necessarily need to change, but the implementation foci will, and how you go about creating community partnerships will change, how you go about thinking about expanded learning opportunities and transportation and wrapping around students and families and outreach and engagement looks very different, right? So if you're in an urban environment, you can literally walk, right? Like transportation might not something we think about, but it's so critical. It impacts the ability for students and families to engage in lots of things. So that's one example which would be different. And there isn't as many. Well, I'll take that back because I don't want to be a deficit based on rurality. There aren't as many like structural resources, but there are certainly social capital that we can lean into in a different way. So I think what changes is the levers of implementation, but not the implementation structure. Because you do need to have some standardized model that then you can play with individually at the local level. And that's what we're doing with logic models, which is a fancy way of showcasing how the activities that you think you're doing in White River are connected to the outcome. So it's going to look a little bit different in White River than it's going to look in Virgins, and it's going to look in Burlington, but we're all on the same page in terms of thinking about similar outcomes. So I think but really there isn't a ton of research on rural community skill implementation. So we were invited to a national conference in Philadelphia, hosted by the Institute for Education Leadership and the Coalition for Community Schools to talk about rural community school implementation in June. Folks are really excited to hear about what's happening in Vermont.
And I'll give you two specific examples. So one would be in most of the sort of national models, the community school coordinator. I remember I presented to a network in Cincinnati, and they were very discouraged to hear that we were providing grant funds and didn't understand why community school coordinators might be school staff.
Right.
And I think one of the challenges is that we have really stressed communities right now who will benefit from this model, and then requiring them to produce a community partner who can produce a community school coordinator to then sit in the education space actually diminishes the capacity versus advancing the capacity. So it doesn't mean we're going to say, now this is only our model, but make sure that our model is flexible to that approach. I think the other piece is many have school-based health centers. Well, I think I don't even have to talk about that, right, to all of you, but I will say what we saw is schools, one district building out a dashboard and having someone who actually across a fairly wide geographic region is actually scheduling medical appointments for students and families, right? And so that kind of supporting that work, not just adding it on and being like, well, if you care about kids, you'll schedule their appointment, but by the way, I'm not adding any resources. I think we have to be open to those kinds of interpretations of the model.
Other questions? Great. Really, it's just been excellent follow-up. When this program first started, I was envisioning, yes, health centers in every school. And when we had the folks in who were actually doing this and sort of bringing it down to the scale that Vermont needs and the impact it was having, it was really interesting. So I'm sorry that we didn't leave a lot of time to talk about our other topic, but I'm not that sorry because it's very interesting. And I think what we'll do is we'll just postpone our other conversation for the committee's benefit. I wanted to just have Jess in to talk about, we have all these bills coming at us wanting to have different kinds of curriculum. And I wanted to get a sense from the state level what that actually means in terms of implementation. We'll do that another day.
Okay.
We'll take 5 minutes and we'll reconvene at 11. Unless there's anything else on, unless you can summarize it in 10 minutes.
Gotta give me a shot. No, I just want to say, and we thank you for, creating this opportunity and also being open to listening and thinking about, from the perspective of the field, what is needed in order to achieve the goal set. I think many of the bills, including bills that you're referencing, are trying to communicate, but maybe don't have the necessary pathway to get there.
While we had you, so tomorrow we're going to have in folks from our congressional delegation, mostly talking about the challenges of accessing federal dollars, given the small state that we are. And I guess, is there any particular message or question that you would like us to ask on your behalf?
Well, I think at the last round of the full service community schools competition, at least the initial draft looked like SEAs could be applicants. In the finalized application or competition, SEAs cannot be applicants. Now, I'm not inviting the process of applying for a federal grant, but I am saying we're willing to do that if it's going to support LEAs and not require them to apply. And so thinking about how can we support SEAs in being the supporting structure for the local education agencies to do this work.
Would I be inaccurate?
Look at that 21C slide.
Would I be inaccurate in saying that the way we support the SEA and being able to take advantage of this is to staff the SEA appropriately to do it?
Right, and we've seen it, right? Like when educators are supported and doing well, kids do well, right? Same thing.
So we are definitely open to any suggestions you have on how we can make it a more effective AOE always.
So a clarifying question then on that federal, so on the federal community schools money, it has to be applied for at the local level.
Or a nonprofit.
And we don't have any, do we have any?
There was one opportunity, the scaling grants, I believe, was that a nonprofit or group of schools could apply, and then the SEA as a partner would have to manage and match the funding. That's not necessarily the relationship that we're encouraging through community school models.
Do you have any idea what a grant amount, if the SEA could apply, like how much federal money we could be getting?
I don't know. But I think, again, in looking at the 21C model, you're usually looking at about $6 million coming in. That supports 100 sites across the state with 5 cohorts over 5 years.
21C is a 5-year commitment, right?
Yeah. And that was a design from the SEA, but again, recognizing that to develop comprehensive change, right, real change takes time.
Are you already in communication with Senator Sanders' office about that? Very specific.
We communicated that, yeah.
Excellent.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And you too.
Committee, can I trust you to take no more than 6 minutes?
Yes.
If so,
Said every break.
I know.
what's that?